We are continuing part 2 of the narration on slide 7 with figure 10.13. Now, this figure shows the situation of a competitive buyer to a competitive seller. So let's just have both figures simultaneously. Okay, so here you have a competitive buyer in part A and a competitive seller in part B. So remember that in a competitive market, your buyers and sellers are price takers. And you have already studied part B of the figure, which deals with competitive sellers in chapter 8. So recall that a competitive seller takes a price P star as given. And remember that in order for a seller to figure out what quantity to produce, that is going to be where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. And that tells you what quantity to produce. And that is also where your marginal revenue equals price, and hence P is equal to MC. So if we have a look, that would be the quantity Q star that would be produced for a competitive seller. Now, if we look at part A, this looks at a competitive buyer, and we have already defined what marginal expenditure and average expenditure is. So you can see in the figure in part A that the price P star is equal to the marginal expenditure, ME, and that's equal to the average expenditure. And this is for a competitive buyer. So the buyer cannot influence the price, they are price takers. So hence the cost of every unit, the extra cost and the average cost is the same per unit, and it is equal to the price. Hence P is equal to ME and AE. So price is, or your marginal expenditure and average expenditure, is given by this red line. Now your demand curve is given by the blue line, and the demand curve, it is also the marginal value schedule. If you think about it, the marginal value, that additional benefit you get from buying one more unit of a good, it's going to fall as more is going to be bought. So as the quantity increases, you can see your demand curve is downward sloping. Hence, your demand curve is your marginal value schedule. So how much must this buyer purchase? How is Q star determined? See, it is the point of intersection between these two curves where marginal value is equal to marginal expenditure. So you purchase the amount where MV is equal to ME. So figure 10.13 dealt with competitive buyers and sellers. Now 10.14 deals exclusively with a monopsonist buyer. So think about part A of figure 10.13 being that of the scenario for a competitive buyer, and this figure now deals with a scenario where you have one buyer. The scenario, there is one buyer, so this is a monopsonist. So a question we need to answer is, how much must a monopsonist buy, because it's one buyer, to maximize the benefit? So in the figure, you can see we have three curves. The marginal value curve, which is the downward sloping blue curve, it is also the demand curve. Then you've got the marginal expenditure curve, which is the, I'd say, pink or lighter orange color. It is upward sloping. And then you've got the supply curve in this dark red magenta color. This is also the average expenditure curve. So note here that your marginal expenditure curve is not equal to your average expenditure curve, as you saw in figure 10.13a. Here we see that our marginal expenditure curve, it actually lies above the average expenditure curve, which is also the supply curve. Now you know that the supply curve tells you how much producers are willing to sell at what price. So it shows you how much the monopsonist must pay for each unit. Hence, it is the average expenditure curve. So since our supply curve is equal to our average expenditure curve and it slopes upward, marginal expenditure must lie above it. The mathematical derivations and explanations of this relationship, it is presented as a footnote in the textbook, but you may read through that for knowledge enrichment purposes. For the purposes of your examination with regards to chapter 10 and its figures, I'm more interested in your interpretation of the figures. Are you able to explain what is given in a particular figure and derive information from that? So let's get back to the figure. So if the monopsonist wants to maximize its benefit, the quantity it must buy, as we saw in the previous figure, it is going to be where marginal value is equal to marginal expenditure. So there's your marginal value and there's your marginal expenditure. Those two curves intersect at that point. So this is the quantity QM star. The M obviously refers to monopsonist. That this is the quantity that the monopsonist will buy. But what is the price that the monopsonist pays? Now, the price the monopsonist pays, if you trace this up to the supply curve, remember the supply curve tells you how much producers are willing to sell at what quantity, at what price. So if you trace this up to the supply curve, for this quantity QM star, the price the monopsonist pays is going to be given by P star M, or PM star M, again for monopsonist. So this is the price that the monopsonist pays. What do you notice about the difference in the price paid by the monopsonist and the quantity? The quantity is again lower than the output or the quantity that would occur in a competitive market, hence QC, that is the output for the competitive market, as well as the price paid by the monopsonist. It is also lower than the price that would have been taken by another buyer in a competitive market. So under competitive market conditions, the quantity and the price would have been greater in both instances. So now let's look at monopsony and monopoly compared. So in the first part of this figure, we are dealing with monopoly, and the second part of the figure will deal with the scenario for monopsony. So monopoly, one seller; monopsony, one buyer. So recall that for a monopolist, the quantity that will maximize profits is going to be where marginal revenue and marginal cost is equal, and that will be at a quantity of Q star. However, the monopolist can charge a price. If we trace it up to the demand curve, which is the average revenue curve, the monopolist can charge a price P star. So you can see that P is greater than marginal cost. Also, if you check the price charged by the monopolist, P star, against the price charged in a competitive market, you can see that P star, the price of the monopolist, is far higher than the price in a competitive market, PC. And also, if we compare the output for a monopolist is Q star, whereas the output under competitive market conditions, that would be QC. So here you find that price is lower under competitive market conditions and output is greater for the competitive market. Now, if we turn our attention to a monopsonist and again do the same sort of comparison, for a monopsonist, we determine the quantity where your marginal value and marginal expenditure is equal. So therefore, the quantity for the monopsonist is going to be Q star. And you saw that the price, if we trace that up to the supply curve, it is going to be at P star. However, for the competitive market, you're going to find that the price is going to be PC, which is higher than the price that your monopsonist gets to pay. And the output is also going to be greater. So the monopsonist has some market power and hence can purchase a buy at a lower price as compared to a buyer in a competitive market, or the price that would prevail in competitive market conditions. So here, if we do another comparison, you can see that the price is again lower than the marginal value. And hence, we can see that this benefit that is derived. Now, figure 10.6 illustrates monopsony power. A pure monopsonist is rare, just like a pure monopoly is rare. So what is more likely is a couple of buyers with some monopsony power. So figure 10.16 shows how monopsony power is affected by the elasticity of supply, and that a buyer is faced with that. So remember, when we looked at monopoly power, we saw that the elasticity of demand affects your monopolist. So we examined that relationship when we looked at monopoly power. But now for monopsony power, we are going to analyze how that comes down to the elasticity of supply. So in part A of the figure, you can see that the supply is the average expenditure curve, and you can see that it's nice and flat. So it is very elastic, right? Also see the difference between marginal value and price. So the difference between the marginal value at that point over there and the price that the monopsonist would get, it's relatively small, the magnitude or the difference between MV minus P star. So this represents the markdown for the monopsonist. For monopoly, we spoke about markup. For a monopsonist, we're speaking about markdown. So remember, a monopsonist is going to gain by being able to buy a good at a price that is below the marginal value. So the P is marked down, right? So for the monopsonist, in this scenario, it only has a small markdown, hence little monopsony power. But now let's look at part B. Notice immediately the supply curve, which is equal to that average revenue curve, it is more inelastic. It is much more steeper. Now compare the difference between, for this quantity Q star for the monopsonist, compare the marginal value at that point. There's your marginal value curve. Compare that marginal value versus the price that the monopsonist would get, and look at the difference, MV minus P star. You can see the magnitude, that difference between marginal value and price at Q star is far greater, and it comes down to the steepness of this supply curve. So here we can see that the markdown is greater, and hence there is greater market power as such, or monopsony power. So they get a greater markdown in price. So again, the sources of monopsony power needs to be examined, and there are three things that affect monopsony power. That is the elasticity of market supply, the number of buyers, and the interaction amongst buyers. I will have to stop recording at this point because the 15 minutes is nearly up, but I will continue with one final and short video just discussing the sources of monopsony power and bilateral monopoly. It's fairly straightforward. You could also just read through it.